My brothers and sisters, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
This is a proclamation of the most holy gospel as we find in the tradition of St. Luke. Great crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and addressed them. If anyone who's to come after me without hating his father, his mother, his wife, his children, brothers and sisters, even his own life, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Which of you wishing to construct a tower does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if there is enough money for its completion? Otherwise, after laying the foundation and finding himself unable to finish his work, the onlookers should laugh and say to him, "This one began to build when he could not have the resources to finish." Or what king marching into battle would first sit down and decide whether with 10,000 troops he can successfully oppose another king advancing upon him with 20,000 troops? But if not, he will still stay far away and send a delegation to ask for terms of peace. In the same way, if anyone who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
I'm sure that we have, at one time or another, come across an individual who just seems a little bit purer, if I can use that word, than most people you meet. Those individuals who just seem to kind of radiate a loveliness. They're nice to look at. I like to think of them coming from Wisconsin, chiseled out of cream cheese. Those individuals who have no blemish. And then all of a sudden one day they open their mouth and they say something that's totally contrary to what they look like. And you're, as we say in Italian, sit there stadamad with your mouth open. I'm sure that these individuals who were following Jesus, this great crowd, however that may be, when he turned and addressed them and said, "Unless you hate your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, your wife, your children, in your very life, you can't be my disciple." The word hate. Hate. One would not think that be in Jesus' vocabulary, given the fact that love seemed to dominate all that he said and did. And yet we have this passage here from Luke's Gospel, saying that unless you are hating your parents, your mother, your father, your brothers, sisters, and so that and everybody else, and your very life, you can't be my disciple. Okay, I wonder how many people said, "Okay, Jesus, thank you very much, and see you around." That happened before, when they turned and walked away. When he said, "Unless you eat the flesh and drink the blood of the Son of Man, you cannot have life within you." Many turned and walked away because they found that this saying was too hard for them to understand. And yet here again we have Jesus saying that we have to turn our backs on everything that in normal society is good. The family, friends, our very self. And we have to be able to give all this up if we want to be his disciple. Then he adds until the entry and says, "If anyone does not want to carry his cross, you can't come after me either." So now I've alienated and hate everybody that is meaningful in my life, and now I got to carry a cross. This is joyful news, isn't it? The gospel. Good news. Well, if this is the good news, I'd hate to see what the bad news is going to be. And yet we know that in allegory, in the writings of the gospel, sometimes translations from the Greek to the English just kind of squeaks in. And we really have to take stock of what Luke is trying to say. I'm sure that there are many interpretations of this passage. Many individuals, commentaries, individuals who study Greek, individuals who study Hebrew in the mind of the Semitic individual would have probably a better understanding of this than I, but in my reading of this gospel, what I see Jesus saying is there cannot be anything more important in your life than the relationship that you have with me. And in this case, it's not just the person Jesus, but the person who Jesus is, and that is God. That once we put anything ahead of our relationship with our God, we begin to try to have the pyramid stand on the point rather than on the base. And we know that that can never happen. And Jesus is saying not that we have to hate these people, but there cannot be anything more important than my relationship with you, your relationship with your God. Because in the end, that's all you have. At the end of life, any relationship that you have with mothers and fathers, brothers, sisters, wives, children, whatever it might be, will come to an end. But that relationship with God goes on forever. So how do we justify what Jesus is saying here? How do we justify the word hate in a gospel that's supposed to be one of love? I guess Jesus is emphasizing it. He's putting an accent on it so that we come to understand that it has to be to that point where we would hate our relatives and our friends, our life, and be willing to take up the cross to follow Jesus. One commentator I read many years ago said that when he was speaking of being a disciple of Christ and picking up the cross, that was a very real prospect of a disciple of the Christian. As Jesus carried a cross to Golgotha, many Christians carried their crosses to their own end. And so the carrying of the cross was a reality. Today we see crosses on our walls. We see crosses on our buildings. We see crosses around our neck. But in that day, to have a cross on our wall or jewelry made out of into a cross or a cross on our building was paramount to probably putting an electric chair on our wall or having one fashioned out of gold around our neck. Because the cross in the early days was not seen as a means of salvation, but rather a means of death, and a horrible death at that. And so we as Christians once again are faced with this dilemma to look at who and what we are in relationship to our God. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we forget that we need to take stock of who and what we are in relationship to God. We do that with our loved ones. We do that with our spouses, our lovers, our brothers, our sisters, our children. We do that with our neighbors. Every once in a while we sit down and we clear the air should there have been a misunderstanding. We get together for family reunions and to do like ducks do and clack our bills and build relationships once again. But sometimes we find ourselves too busy to restore relationships. We find ourselves too busy to take time to think of our relationship with our God, much less anybody else. And we go through our day hoping that the relationship that we have is strong enough, powerful enough to last without any more energy. And sometimes we find ourselves at the end of the day realizing that that does not necessarily work. And that we do find ourselves alone because we have not worked at that relationship. We have not allowed ourselves to put those things away which are not important. As many as you know, I've been in the process of moving, and I'm staying with Brother Richard right now because I'm homeless. I haven't closed on the apartment that I'm moving into, and I closed on the house that I used to live in. And in the process, it was a very difficult process because of the fact there was a lot of stuff that we just didn't have room for, and so you have to leave it behind. And you begin to wonder what it is. I mean, after 21 years of living in a house, every time you open up a closet or a drawer, you go, oh my God, why did I keep this? I haven't seen this in 15 years. And so you find yourself saying, oh, but I might need this. And so we put it in the box of might need, so that it can go in the closet of hide what might be needed for the next 20 years. And those things which are so precious to me now become trash to my niece or nephew who have to clean up after me. And I began to realize as I left things behind, and I said to a friend of mine, Jim, who I was roommate for the last 21 years, I said, I tried to liken it to something, and I said, I feel like we've had a hurricane in the house, and you stand there looking at all this stuff that has been tossed and turned, and you're going through picking up what you hope can be something to salvage a picture, and you're just kind of numb at what has taken place. And then I began to realize what Father Francis says, we are individuals who own nothing. Because when you own something, then you have to be responsible for that thing you own, and you have to protect that thing you own. And so the next thing you know, you're protecting it with guns and swords and all the rest. And sometimes lessons in religious life are harder to accept than others when you have to walk away from a house of 21 years, leaving so much behind. But as people keep on telling me, it's only stuff. It's only stuff. And when I go through the boxes that I did move, probably I'll get rid of a lot more. Because I begin to realize that that which is important to me, or I think is important, really isn't. Because the more things we have, the less time we have to think of more important things, of our relationships with one another. Because we're too busy counting our clay coins to see how much we have and hoarding them away in places that nobody else knows, and feeling secure that we have all this stuff, only to find that one day all that stuff goes to another. Sometimes I wonder whether this was an evil wish that I had on my family, that I would die and they'd have to dispose of all this junk. But I realize that that probably is not it. We all have a tendency to be hoarders. And so tonight we listen to the words of the Lord. We have to hate. And hate in the sense of having that sense of energy and that sense of emotion against something that means nothing to me in light of what God means to me. Now, obviously, a little later on in the Lucan story, he tells us that we have to love our enemies as ourselves. Well, where do we draw the line of what we hate and what we love? But that's a contradiction of the Christian life. We love that which we're supposed to hate, and we hate that which we're supposed to love. And as many times I have said to people and to my own self, God draws straight with crooked lines. And sometimes we don't know where we are going or how we get there, much less how we got to where we are at this moment. For I'm sure that each one of you can look back in your lives and say, what? How? This was not supposed to happen. But it did. You're sitting in a little church on the busy road of 9th Avenue in Wilton Manors in Florida, and you're wondering, but I wasn't supposed to leave New Jersey. Oh well. As we say here at St. Francis and Clare, expect the unexpected. But God brings us to where we want to be and where He wants us to be. And sometimes He makes it pleasurable, and sometimes He makes it a little tough. But in the end of the day, we know that there's a God who loves us, who cares about us, and will make things all okay. And though I don't have 4 pressure cookers, a closet full of clothes, and all that stuff, it's going to be okay. Because God provides. And He provides in the strangest of ways. It may not be exactly what I want, but there will always be exactly what I need. And so tonight, we sit down and calculate, as Jesus said, can I overcome a king with 10,000 troops who has 20,000? If not, maybe it's time for me to seek some kind of arbitration of peace. And sometimes we are the ones who are warring against ourselves. And maybe sometime in the future we can have time to sit down and to negotiate terms of peace with ourselves and decide what is truly important in my life. Please God, we choose the right one. Please God, we choose the God of our salvation. In the book of Deuteronomy, the question was put before the Jews. You are to choose whether you want life or death. Moses says, I choose life, as did Joshua. As for me, my family and I will worship the living God, and only this God of ours shall I worship. The question stands before us all the time. We may not be able to answer it tonight, but in the quiet moment, and I can promise you this, in a moment of quiet when you least expect, the question will be raised and you will have to answer. Amen.